Welcome everybody to another live stream developer cast here on the Game Wisdom channel. I am of course Josh Beiser, and we have another great one for you tonight. My guest is currently working at Blue Manchu Games. They are the developers behind the hit indie game Card Hunters, and they're currently working on the recently announced roguelike shooter Void Bastards. So please welcome to the stream tonight, Farb. Or is it Farbs? You have a...
Yes, it's Farbs with an S.
Okay, got it. All right, Farbs, how are you doing? For those who don't know, Farbs is in Australia, so my evening is, I think, his, tomorrow afternoon. So how is it in your afternoon there?
Right, no, it's Tuesday morning right now. Tuesday morning's working out okay. Not much to say about it so far.
All right. It's probably a lot nicer there than it is over here. We're finally entering winter time, so it's getting cold, it's getting dark early. You know, not a very nice time, at least around here.
Cool. Well, I'm a pretty big fan of the snow, so I'm just hanging out for winter. So if you want to swap, that's fine by me.
Awesome. So, like we said, it's been, I think the last time I spoke with someone from Blue Manchu, it was when I spoke with Joe McDonough, when he was helping you guys with Card Hunters, all those many years and decades ago, since the first game came out.
Right. Yeah, so Card Hunter, I think it had its 5th birthday this year. We're pretty happy with how it's gone. Since release, we even pushed up quite a few extra expansion packs and things. I convinced John to let me roll out a whole co-op system.
Nice.
Because that's just something people wanted. I think a lot of people, when they looked at the game, they would see things in it that they were excited about, right? Like, let me roll back actually, tell a little story. When we first showed it at PAX, I was really fascinated by the answer to the question, is this the kind of game that you play? Because people would answer in all kinds of different ways, right? We would have people say, yes, I love D&D, or yeah, I'm really into card games, or strategy games are totally my thing. And it was kind of a bit of all of those things, and so it kind of worked, but it was really that people would see these different aspects of it that worked for them. And since it was, the campaign was just single player at launch, that whole D&D side of it didn't quite work out, so being able to give people the option to party up and run those same adventures with a group of friends, I think was really cool.
And like you said, it's been about 5 years since Card Hunter came out, and it went on Steam, I believe, according to the profile, in 2015. So
Right.
It's very interesting about how the game was originally launched as its own standalone title, and then was brought to the platform. So I mean, 5 years ago, that would place it around 2013. A very interesting time, as Steam was still relatively, considering, the big game in town in terms of getting your game out there for people to see. And I'm curious for you, Farbs, how well did Card Hunter do, pre-Steam versus post-Steam? Was there any, big difference that you guys saw?
I think they were about the same, which is pretty good, right? We had a second launch that was about as big as our first launch, so that's a big deal, right? So we were pretty happy with that. Unfortunately, it meant that our servers caught fire twice instead of once. But they're fine now if anybody wants to play.
Right. And a quick question from Mike in chat. He wants to know, where in Australia are you guys located?
Okay, we're in Canberra, which, I don't know, has anybody heard of Canberra?
Well, I'm East Coast United States, so definitely not me. Maybe Mike, because I think he is in Australia right now. But, with that said, we kind of skipped a little bit ahead. For people who are new tuning in, whether we're live or recorded, could you talk a little bit about your background in the game industry and kind of what Blue Manchu Games is?
Yeah, right. Okay. So, Blue Manchu Games is basically Jonathan Che, one of the founders of Irrational Games, which then was purchased by 2K and became studios like 2K Boston and 2K Australia, and I think in a sense kind of 2K Marin, but not, but that's really complicated. Anyway, that studio, well, John doesn't work there anymore, and in fact the Australian branch doesn't exist. And so Blue Manchu is really, John was done with that particular studio, but wanted to keep making games, and so he has just been sort of phoning up people who he knows through working in that studio and saying, "Hey, who wants to jump on board and do some stuff?" And yeah, that's kind of how Blue Manchu started, I think. John wanted to make another game, called people he knew.
That's pretty much how it works in a lot of the independent space. It's just
Yeah,
call
yeah, I
everybody you
think
know.
so. Yeah. So, I mean, nearly all of us had all worked at that studio at some point in time, which is kind of funny because one of our artists right now, I left before he started, so we never actually worked together. But we still just sort of ended up in the same studio because we were in Canberra. We knew the same people. Yeah, that's how it works.
Yeah. And for people who aren't familiar with the studio, what are some of the titles that you had a chance to work on?
Oh, me personally? That's that's a harsh question. So I joined Irrational while people were working on BioShock, but I was brought on for the other project that was happening at the time, and I sort of was working on that, doing prototype after prototype, and watching all of my team slowly get dragged over to the BioShock side of the fence and things. The only reason I think that I was able to keep working on that original project was that the Boston studio had never met me, so they didn't know to ask for me to be on their team. So yeah, and this is the bit where I admit that I was working on the first-person XCOM game. That look, we had a lot of interesting ideas for that, and I totally get why the fans went, "Hey, it's XCOM." Wait, that's not XCOM. And well, a few people were not too happy about that. But we did have some pretty cool ideas in the early stages about how that would work. And I think what's kind of cool about Void Bastards, which is, the game we're working on right now, is it's given us an opportunity to revisit some of those ideas that didn't make it into the final game, or that, were in one or two of the prototypes, but not in the final product, and think about how they would work and have a crack at making it ourselves in just a smaller team, smaller budget kind of way.
Yeah. And I'll be honest with you, Farbs, I was actually one of the people who was excited about a first-person XCOM. I'll admit that. I was really curious to see what you guys were planning on doing there with kind of the persistence systems and translating that into first person. And I will say I am one probably few people who did play XCOM The Bureau when after all the craziness kind of settled and and where that game landed.
Fair enough. I'd actually quit sometime before that happened, so I wasn't really involved in the final product in the end after all. But that was what my years at that studio were about. Yeah. I think I got a little frustrated after a while, because what we would do is we would build a demo and a concept and a vertical slice, and we would all work hard on that, and then suddenly there'd be a change in direction and we'd have to build a different one, and then a change in direction, we'd build a different one. And we did that about 5 times. And I was sitting there just looking at my CV, seeing it get nothing added to it year after year. But in the meantime, I'd started working on my own smaller independent stuff just on the side, just little freeware things, and that was really starting to get some traction. So I ended up quitting to go and do my own independent thing, which back then was like a big deal. These days, it's just what everybody does. But yeah.
And I guess for you, Farbs, did you join Blue Manchu at the beginning, or did you come in later?
Right. So I'm trying to remember if you even had the name Blue Manchu when I joined. So yeah, I think I would have been there pretty close to the beginning. Like, John called me up out of the blue. I just spent a couple of years working on my own solo projects, and was working on those. But I had sort of reached the end of something, and so when John just phoned me up out of the blue and said, "Hey, do you want to work on a new thing?" I thought, well, I'll have a look. I came around. We played a paper version of what he thought Card Hunter might be. Card Hunter was, of course, just a working title, and wouldn't be what it was called. We just hadn't thought of a name yet. And yeah, no, I think that was probably pretty close to the start, because I think he was talking with Ben at the time, but that was about it.
Okay. And
Yeah.
Mike is asking, how is the game dev scene in the ACT?
We're really terrible at keeping in touch with people about that kind of thing. So, I mean, I guess there is one, right? There's the Academy of Interactive Entertainment really gets involved in sort of trying to find a pathway for their students once they've finished learning to go and work on their own projects, and they've set up a space for them to work in that in, and there's meetups and things, but I never get around to going to them, so I'm not really sure. But yeah, other than us, Blue Manchu, which is like, we've got about 5 people in Canberra. There's also Uppercut Games, which is another studio that came out of the whole 2K Australia mess. And then a bunch of smaller teams who I don't really know very well.
All right. And
Yeah.
with developing Car Hunter, we'll move on to Void Bastards in a few minutes. I just wanted to get your thoughts on, like, again, when Car Hunter came out back in 2013, it was still like it was one of like those very first games, like from the independent side, to really focus on, again, like the idea of a lifestyle or an ongoing game. And I guess with developing Card Hunter Al, I guess, what did you learn in terms of working on a game that, you know, isn't supposed to be finished in a year or 2 years, but something that's still going on 5+ years later?
I think what we learned was that that's not for us. That makes sense. Like, it's, yeah, you get excited about a project, you work really hard at it, you get to launch, you burn yourself out getting it just perfect for day one, and then you want to have a nap.
Yeah.
Or do something different for a little while. So I think Card Hunter has been a little tricky. Like, our team wasn't really big enough to just keep churning out, like, here's a new adventure every single week.
Yeah.
And so for the first sort of couple of years of live on Card Hunter, we would work on bigger expansions and sort of swing them out at a lower frequency, which I think probably isn't the ideal way to run a live game service, but it's just sort of what was able to work for the team that we had.
Yeah, and as Draken said in chat above, like, when these lifestyle games are, you just keep adding multiplayer. Now we have battle royales. You know, just keep adding more to it. And as you said,
Yeah.
Farbs, that, yeah, like, a lot of people expect, like, with a lifestyle game, just keep rolling out content every week. You know, developers can handle that. You know, new expansion stuff every 30 days. You know, that stuff's easy, right?
Yeah, that kind of thing, just like, you need a dedicated team to doing that kind of thing. And the Card Hunter team was pretty small all the way through. So I think, you know, we've definitely added content, and we've, like I said, we rolled out co-op, which just wasn't there. It was a ton of work. We added a league system. I built a whole guild metagame around it. All kinds of stuff like that got added. But it's not like we have a live team of 10 people 24/7 working on this.
And if you don't mind me asking, as you said, like, you came around, like, when it was still just like a paper prototype. What was, like, the original, like, inspiration, or like the original, like, where Card Hunter came from, like, as like kind of being the first game from Blue Manchu?
Yeah, right. Are you familiar with the Cones of Dunshaugh?
Is that is that a game from Parks and Recreation?
I believe that's the one.
Yeah.
That's my understanding of where this came from. Basically, John was sitting alone in his house for a little bit too long. No, I think really it was just that this is a kind of game that John had actually wanted to do for a long time, but had never managed to get his previous studio sort of lined up to do. You know, he's very into card games, very into board games, interested in the intersection between the two, and just wanted to make something like that. And we looked at it and went, oh yeah, okay, that's cool, and we'll make it like a browser game, and it'll be running and using Flash, and it'll take us 6 months, and it'll be just a good, like, little quick project to get out. And it took a few years, because they always do, and we're still working on it.
And with Card Hunter, I guess another question. When the game was, this is just something that I'm curious about, when the game was moved over to Steam in
Mhm.
2015, did you guys have to do anything like different or special to update the game to make it Steam compatible, or did it go like relatively smooth?
Okay. Yeah, I think Jason Moulton worked mostly on that. But the biggest part of it, I think, was just the fact that until it arrived on Steam, it was only ever playable in browser.
Hmm.
And so we needed to work on wrapping the whole thing up into a standalone executable. We needed to support Steam payment systems. We needed to support achievements, all that kind of stuff. Um, so, it was just a lot of sort of back end work. Well, not back end, I guess that means the server, but it was a lot of tech work. But not much changed in terms of like what the game looks like and how it plays moment to moment.
All right. And
Yeah.
for people watching us live right now, if you have any Card Hunter related questions for Farbs, feel free to get them in now, because we'll be moving on to Void Bastards probably in like the next 5 to 10 minutes, give or take. But there's one aspect of Card Hunters I want to touch on. Like
Sure.
one of like the big things we've been seeing more in the AAA or even in the independent space these last few years or even these last few months has been a greater focus on microtransactions, monetization, all those lovely words that consumers love to hear, like loot boxes and gotcha.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
with Card Hunter, I remember with the original release, you had like your own internal currency. I think it was slices of pizza, which
Hmm.
I like slices of pizza myself. I think we all can agree on that. But
Right.
with the design of Card Hunters, like how did Blue Manchu kind of approach the monetization side? Because again, we're talking 2013, so this was long before loot boxes started to become prevalent, long before
Right.
a lot of the stuff has become kind of known in the mainstream market.
So I would say that we approached it out of fear.
Hmm.
Like we were looking at this project we wanted to do, we were looking at what games were doing at the time, and we were seeing a shift towards free to play. And we thought, like, this is going to be a big thing. Like, not so much this is an opportunity to make a ton of money, so much as oh shit, this is going to eat up all of the standalone sales. We like if we want to be able to keep operating in the game dev space, if we want to keep making games and make a living off it, then this is what we need to learn to do.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's basically why that's the approach we took. Um, as for sort of how we designed our systems, I think it was really just like we thought about what we thought was reasonable and fair and what we thought people would want. And I think that's part of why we didn't get rich making Card Hunter. Just didn't have the right mindset to really scrape money out of people. But we made some money. It was okay. It wasn't the project didn't break us, but it didn't make us.
Hmm. And that's always that very tricky aspect when it comes to these kinds of games is how do you balance making a fun game versus making a game that can earn you the money to keep going? And it's a ever, present challenge and one we're not going to be solving on our little cast tonight. But
Yeah,
it's good to hear that the game did earn enough to keep you guys going and
yeah, yeah.
keep the studio alive and obviously making Void Bastards, as we'll be talking about in the next few
Right, right.
minutes.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think we one of the other things that we really hit with Card Hunter is the expectation that if a game is free, but with optional microtransactions, then in order to be competitive at it, because there's a competitive side to Card Hunter, you just have to spend a ton of money. And we worked very hard to make sure that that was absolutely, definitely not true. But because the perception's there, because there's the perception that even in the single player campaign, you're going to hit paywalls, and unless you buy the cool item, you can't get through. Then that was the expectation a lot of people came with, and we ended up getting like our Steam review score is pretty good, but it's mostly dragged down by people claiming that they hit a paywall or that we cheat the random number generator or all kinds of things that are completely untrue, which is excruciatingly frustrating.
Oh, yes.
Um, but that's just the perspective they came with, and there's not much we can do about that.
Hmm. And as someone who has played XCOM, Darkest Dungeon, and many other RNG or probability-based games, I've had a lot of fun when like 90% things have missed, or when you get a reward and you can't use it. So I am the arbiter of bad luck when it comes to RNG. I'm pretty sure with Car Hunter, I remember like all my friends are like, "This game is easy." You know, I beat the level, I got this great item, and everything else was easy. I'm like, I got nothing. Like nothing worked for me in that game. I got all the bad loot drops, and I'm like, yeah, I'm in trouble here. And like, why are you having so much trouble? I gotta use this legendary artifact. Like, I got nothing here. Like, it's always my bad luck when it comes to RNG.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting seeing that playing out as well. What was I going to say? I think sometimes you see people assuming it's RNG when they just haven't quite figured out the right way to do something, and it's hard to know which side of the fence you landed on there. So I'm not accusing you of just being terrible at the game, but sometimes people are just terrible at the game, and it's always a bit eye-opening trying to figure out what people are doing wrong when they're playing a game, like how they're struggling and why, and what you can do about that.
Yep.
So one of the issues we had with Card Hunter was that it's got sort of an RPG setup in terms of you're getting loot and you're equipping loot, and then you're using that to do bigger battles where you earn better loot, and you know it's the traditional sort of treadmill-y type thing. And in a lot of games, as soon as you get a new sword, you look at it, you look at your old sword, and you pick one and you sell the other one. And that makes perfect sense in a lot of games, right? You just keep the best one or the one you like most. But Card Hunter, you really, really need a diverse set of equipment to be able to change between, right? Like, if you're up against skeletons, then you can't stab at them with the sword because the sword just goes between the ribs. You need something that does crushing damage. And if you just sold all of your crushing damage stuff, then you're screwed.
Yep.
And so we had to add this weird extra little limitation. And we did this sometime after launch because we started seeing people doing this, where you just can't access the shop and sell stuff until like later in the game once you've got your head around that. Because otherwise people are just tying themselves in knots.
Yep. And that's kind of where like the CCG aspect of Card Hunters come in, because as you said, is a game built on kind of like those hard rules. Like if you sell all your fire resistant armor and you're up against an enemy who does fire damage, you're in deep trouble. But with that fire armor on, that fight becomes, you know, a cakewalk, because you're dealing with all these hard rules of how these things connect with each other.
Yep. Yeah. So that's fun.
Yeah.
But Void Bastards is nothing like that, so it won't be a problem.
And yeah, as Draken's talking about in chat, it's always interesting when you start combining those rules. Because traditionally, as we know, when it comes to RPGs, higher number is better. If my sword does 10 points of damage and this one does 20 points, well, 20 points is higher than 10. Let me put that one on. But as you said, like it's one of those very interesting things. The same thing I ran into with a game like Darkest Dungeon, that you can. There's a big difference between doing the right thing and having RNG completely mess you up, versus you're doing the wrong thing and you're not understanding why it's wrong. And that is a discussion that could fill its own podcast easily if we start getting onto that topic. But yeah, it's that very fascinating thing that I think not just you, but like any developer who's ran into when it comes to RNG and probability, because the consumer doesn't understand. Again, we go back to this, that 95% doesn't equal 100. That you can still miss at 95%. That's not the game telling you that, oh, it's guaranteed. And we've seen developers, like I know XCOM, Farbs is famous for this, of saying that they, quote-unquote, fudge the numbers a little bit, that it may say it's 75, but it could be more 80 to 85 if you've been missing a lot. And we don't see a lot of games, or the ones that haven't admitted it, go for, you know, pure numbers, meaning that if it's 60%, then it is absolutely 60% every time you try to make that hit.
Yeah, and we went with the not fudging approach, which I think is part of why we got so many accusations of fudging.
Hmm.
Um,
You can't win. I think that's the number one rule when it comes to RNG and probability. You can never win because you
well, I
will.
think
Yep.
that what was partially interesting about that, I think, is that we probably would have considered fudging it if we didn't have a competitive aspect to the game. And this is one of those
Yep.
things where, because we made a long, like 40-hour single player campaign as well as sort of ranked play, we needed to design for both. And sometimes that would just mean that one of those would impact on the other.
Yep. Yeah, and as you said, Farbs, it's very interesting when you throw in competitive play in the mix, because again, Core Hunters was originally just single or player versus AI, and when you're dealing with the
Uh,
AI, oh, I'm sorry.
well, no, we launched with
Oh yeah,
ranked as well. Yep.
oh yeah, that's right. Like oh, let me rephrase that then. Like when you see traditional games that feature like asymmetrical bounds or these hard rules, when it's single versus AI, you can get
Mhm.
away with a lot of these things, such as in like the original form of XCOM or Firaxis' XCOM, that they
Mhm.
didn't really have multiplayer. I think until I think multiplayer was in XCOM 2. I don't remember for sure, but
Right.
in traditional asymmetrical balance, you can fudge those numbers because the player is never going to see like the opposite side of things, such as in the Darkest Dungeon. But
Mhm.
when it's two players competing with each other, then you gotta be really careful, especially with how these rules work. Because if you make it so like the first player who draws, let's say, a speed boost wins, well, it's not going to be that much fun for the player who's not getting that luck. And
Right.
it's a very common thing we see in just about any CCG based system, such as in Hearthstone, Gwent, and again, the many, many other titles that have tried to go along those lines.
Mhm.
But
Yeah. Totally.
But I think with that said, again, we can sit here and talk about card hunters and CCGs for the next hour and a half, 2 hours. Forbes has said
Yeah.
that he does have a soft stop point about 5 hours. Like he does have to pick up his child at some point. But we're
Mhm.
for the people watching, that sounds great to them. But we'll probably collapse, long before then. But I think with that said, regarding card hunters, is there anything else like interesting or design related that you want to discuss, or we can move on to Void Bastards next?
Um, I guess we should probably move on to Void Bastards. Like I can definitely talk about Card Hunter a lot more if there's specific things you want to talk about, but there's nothing sort of I've been dying to get off my chest for the last 5 years, if that's what you're asking.
All right. Uh, Mojo saying, let the man talk. Dragon saying, it'll be fun to watch you both collapse. See, the audience, they're here to watch us suffer. They don't care
Okay.
like about us like having a, running out of a liquid or saliva. They just want to see us talk for the next like 5 to 10 hours.
So it's more like a Survivor endurance challenge. I always wondered how I'd go at one of those.
I think I would lose very quickly, but I don't know. But with that said, let's talk a little bit about Void Bastards, as that is the
Yeah.
latest game from Blue Manchu, and again, I'm sure that will fill up this cast and then some.
Yeah, probably. Um,
So,
Fire
I guess to begin with, for people watching us live record who have no idea what we're talking about, what is kind of
right.
the elevator pitch for Void Bastards?
The elevator pitch for Void Bastards. All right. If you imagine a hybrid between FTL and System Shock 2, that's sort of where we're aiming for. So uh, we use the term strategy shooter a lot. That's our best way of summing up what we're looking at here. It's a first-person shooter with a million different game mechanics all interacting with each other. And so a lot of what you're doing isn't just pointing and clicking and using your reflexes, although there is a fair bit of, firing weapons at things. There's also just a huge amount of thinking about where you want to go, when you want to go somewhere, what tools you want to use, what you want to use them on, in what order, to get which of your potential goals right now before you decide that you have faced enough threat in order to bail out back to the other half of the game, which is this sort of strategy layer of moving your little pod between different spaceships trapped in a nebula. This is the longest sentence I've ever spoken. And I think the elevator's just arrived.
Yeah. But name dropping FTL and System Shock, I think, has probably got a lot of people very interested. I know my ears got peaked up there as you were describing it.
Okay, so one of the reasons we talk about System Shock 2 is that John, who is sort of running Blue Manchu, he was a design director, I think, or producer. I can't remember what his title was, but he was one of the few people working and was right there at the top of the chain on System Shock 2. And in my head, Shock 2 was always this game that came about. Like, there would have been a lot of people working on it, but I kind of see these two main influences, one being John and the other being Ken Levine. And so they were working on that together. And you can see the John side of the equation was all about these systems that interact with each other. You know, let's have a security system, let's have turrets, let's have cameras, let's have monsters that keep respawning rather than just levels you walk through, let's have backtracking, let's have, you know, let's create a systemic world. And the other side is John, which was all about the characters and the narrative and how that all ties together. And what you can see from that is that then Ken had another crack at it with BioShock, which people seem to have liked quite a lot, and sort of has continued off in that direction where he's moving a little further away from the systemic aspect of how the games play and pushing further and further into the narrative. What is this world? What does it mean? Who are the characters? How do they interact with each other? That kind of thing. Whereas Void Bastards is John having his go at it, taking his side of the System Shock 2 concept and really pushing on the, you know, what if the enemies are smart or stupid and you can lock doors so they can't get through, so they have to pathfind around, by which point you've dropped the trap because you know which way they're going to pathfind around to get you, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's why we talk about that game. The reason we talk about FTL is that we really want to foreground that whole if you've seen a picture of our star map, the part where you're sort of jumping from ship to ship, quite often in a game something like that would just be level selection. It wouldn't be particularly meaningful, whereas we've built an actual strategy game into that where you're balancing resources and making decisions based on who's going where and what you do and don't want to encounter and things like that. So we've got things like, there's, you know, it's as simple as there is a junk ship that you want to catch up with because you get a cool part if you catch it. But on the other end of the scale, there's also the Void Whale, which if you ever touch that, your character's just dead, instant death. That's it. So the star map is a lot more than level selection. It is very definitely a place where you can die.
You can die anywhere in a good roguelike. I think that's what we've learned
that's right.
Many times over.
You said the magic words, and so now I'm going to talk about them. You said roguelike, and we don't. Oh. That's all right. I think it's reasonable for people to see what we're talking about with Void Bastards and see the footage and think about it and say, oh yeah, it's a roguelike. And the reason we don't use that term is that a lot of the time these days that's used to describe games that are very permadeathy, right? Mm-hmm. The moment you die, okay, great, now try again, but try to have a bit more luck and a bit more skill, try and learn from your mistakes, and eventually you'll be able to get through the game. That's not what we're trying to do, right? We don't want to make a game where only the very best of the best can complete it and the game only takes an hour. We've made like a 12 to 20 hour game where basically anybody can complete it. And your skill, it'll impact things like how quickly you get through it and at what difficulty you can play, but it's not going to impact your capacity to get through it all.
Okay. And I think that's a very interesting distinction, Farbs. And I have another point I need to go back to in a few minutes, but to stay on this one, like, when we look at, like as you said, when we look at traditional roguelikes, even like something like the Dark Souls formula, the Souls-like formula, that it's very much, as you said, you die, you repeat this content, you have to go back through it again, or in a roguelike, as we all know, you die, and you're back at the original playthrough. You know, everything that you've done is white. And as you mentioned, like with FTL, that's a pitch-perfect example. You die at the final section of FTL, you're back
That's
at the
it.
start. You're back to square one. You know, everything you just did, nice to see again. It's gone, kind of thing.
Yeah,
And
so we spent a bunch of time looking at Rogue Legacy was a big
mhm.
inspiration for us
Oh,
in terms of our game loop inspiration.
hmm,
We really like the idea of just, yeah, persistent building up of your character, and
hmm,
that's the thing that allows you to just keep getting deeper and deeper into the nebula and closer to the end of the game.
yeah. And like with something like Rolex, I'll get to your question in a second, Mojo. Like as you said, it's about just that consistent core gameplay loop of I keep growing more powerful, so it lets me get a little bit further, so I grow more powerful, and everything just keeps building and building. So eventually, you'll get to that point of just pure power, where even somebody who's horrible at the platforming and the action side will just be able
Mhm.
to just kind of like quote unquote brute force it. But in the
Right.
same breath, you know, somebody who knows what they're doing, they'll be able to get through the game a lot quicker. And I think that's one of the more important distinctions because I've played several games that have had like roguelike elements where it goes, you can play this game, but until you hit level 15 and you get X amount of weapon power, you're never going to beat this game. It doesn't matter how great you are. Like, you have to keep
Right.
living and dying until you hit that magic breakpoint.
Well, I think part of what allows Rogue, what's my game called? Void Bastards
Rogue
to,
Bastards, that's the
yeah,
next
Rogue
one.
Bastards, yeah. Part of what helps us get around that is the fact that there is never a case in our game where you have to defeat an enemy.
Hmm.
Um, when you go onto a ship, you're not there to kill all the monsters, and you're not there to battle your way past an end boss or anything like that. You're there to pick up some supplies, some parts, whatever it is that you came in for, and then leave again. And so it is always entirely possible to find a way to sort of trick them into looking in the wrong direction and lock the right doors so they can't follow you. And it's not a full-on stealth game, but it's definitely something where you can manage how much combat you get into.
Hmm.
And in fact, it's fascinating watching people, just even in the development team, play the game. We've got one person who likes to collect everything and wipe every ship clean if they can. And we've got another guy he's in a bit of a hurry. And if he sees an enemy that's not particularly high level, he will check his health and go, you know what? I can take 3 hits. And he will run straight past him. And so, yeah, it's all about sort of choosing what you want to do, but actually attaining that goal of, for us, our main loop is you collect parts, and then you use those parts to build our various upgrades, including the sort of big story beat progress ones. Um, yeah, collecting the part isn't intrinsically linked to killing the monsters. The monsters are just a thing that's there and a bit in the way.
Hmm. And I want to ask you more about the general combat in a minute. But
Mhm.
going to Mojo's question in chat, will you guys
Sure.
have co-op or multiplayer in Void Bastards?
We will not. Sorry. I get that that's a thing that's nice to have, but it is a huge amount of work. And if we were to have that, we wouldn't be shipping for several more years. Um, that's just not going to happen.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
um, going back to the point I wanted to bring up from a few minutes ago, as you were describing kind of the two halves of the shock formula, again, the narrative and kind of like that story driven focus and the systemic design, I was pretty much
Hmm.
smiling the whole discussion because, like, talking about like the systemic nature, like the quote unquote emergent game design or emergent gameplay, is one of my
Hmm.
favorite things. Like, of course, I'm sure you're well aware of Prey 2016 that came out from
Yeah.
Arcane,
Yeah.
and that kind of just the granularity of the detail of everything you can do in that world. And how everything kind of builds on top of each other. And just like with the older System Shock games, like you are free to explore. You can set up these crazy convoluted plans of, you know, using what was like the foam gun to set up a platform so you can snipe an enemy from down below or trigger a trap and all that other great stuff. And it really is like its own kind of like master level of game design when you start thinking about your game in the systemic point of view. And I want to ask you about how like Void Bastards is built upon that. I think that'll also be a great segue into talking more about how combat works.
Sure. So for us, it really is just a case of, here is a system that we think would fit in the world. Let's build it in the simplest way possible and see how that interacts with everything else, and then modify it until we really like the way it interacts with other things, and then we'll actually build it properly and polish it up and make it work nicely. And that's been our process on this game since I think within about the first month we had something playable, and we've been working on it for about 3 years. So there's just been sort of system after system laid on top as we look at how it all interacts with each other. And that's been our biggest thing, is getting our loops right in terms of what you keep and what you don't when you die, and when you can upgrade and build stuff and when you can't, and how everything works has really been a huge focus for this game. It's not like pick up a template for how a game works and then build your world inside it. It's figure out how this game's going to work. So yeah, that's been a large part of what we're doing. I think a really cool example came up recently with the we did like an 18-minute gameplay demo, like not a demo, sorry, a video just demonstrating the game. And in that, I saw a couple of strategies I'd never used before or even thought of, because I wasn't making the video. And so yeah, somebody used the Rift gun, which is something you can use to teleport enemies around, and dropped one of them on an exposed wire that was sparking, so that enemy was now shook for a while in order to buy themselves some more time. And that was brilliant. I'd never done that. Yeah, I want to do that now.
There you go. And that is like the perfect explanation about like how emergent game design can really elevate these titles. Because you never know, as you said, as you're building these individual little systems, how everything's going to eventually coalesce together, or how you start finding those combinations.
And it's not like you can argue about it in the office and think about it and things, but until you build it, you just don't really know what people are going to do with it.
And for my next question, Mojo asks, will this be, when you're planning on releasing Void Bastards, is it going to be coming out as a complete game, or will you be going the early access route first?
We're currently expecting to go complete game.
Okay.
And that'll be sometime, we're expecting early 2019.
Cool. And I have a few, and a lot of my questions are, we're going to be kind of getting to like the design and philosophy of the game portion here. So if there's anything that's like you can't reveal yet, definitely feel free to mention it, and I won't feel too sad about it.
Okay, that's fine. We're not really embargoing anything, so ask me any question you like.
Awesome. And for the people watching us live right now, I guess Farbs giving you the green light as well, so get those gameplay related questions in too. But
yeah, fire.
Yeah. So I guess what you've been describing as what Draken just mentioned in chat about get in, grab stuff, get out. I want to ask you a little bit more about combat, and I also want, and then we'll talk a little bit more about strategy as well. So from the videos that have been put out, what I've seen in terms of screenshots, like from what I saw, it looks very much like a very fast-paced, a very combat-focused kind of title. But from what you've been describing, it looks like it's going to be a lot more of a slower paced shooter. So I guess in terms of like general combat, like where do you see like Void Bastards? Like in terms of like, as you said, like this isn't going to be like, I think, like pure like Twitch shooter. Like you're not going to need Quake 2 rocket jumping skills in order to master this game. Yeah,
in fact, we find very few reasons for the player to jump. Okay. So part of the reason behind that being what you saw is that a huge amount of the game in Void Bastards takes place in the player's head.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to show in a video what somebody's thinking.
Yeah.
Where it is much easier to show what they're doing. So it's harder to show the reason behind why they chose Corridor A instead of Corridor B, and why they chose to engage enemy A with weapon C rather than weapon B, and things like that, than it is to just show them doing those things. And that's been an interesting struggle with us, actually, is to really sort of explain the game in terms of why decisions are being made. That's why I think our gameplay video, I think, really works a lot better to explain that. Like our trailer video, you know, was hype and exciting and shit happening real fast, and that was great. But yeah, it's difficult to sort of do something exciting that then shows somebody thinking about what they're doing. The other aspect of this, though, I think, is that it's not a slow strategic game, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're making decisions, but you're not making them over the course of about 5 minutes and then setting everything up and then triggering the enemy to come and walk into your trap, right? They're constantly on the move, prowling around the ship. You have an oxygen supply that's ticking down, so you've got to think about what you're doing, but actually, you know, engage and get things done. So I guess a way of thinking of it is that it's a reactive strategic game rather than a proactive strategic game.
Yeah, and I think that kind of fits into more my play style. But I want to touch on a point you just said there regarding explaining, you know, the why behind the decisions. I think that's its own very interesting topic. Like, for myself, like, the fans who are watching, or my fans who are watching right now, they know that when I play games like Renowned Explorers, Darkest Dungeon, FTL, whatever, I always explain, like, why I'm making this choice. Why am I hitting this part of the ship? And as you said, it's very hard to show that in a video. Like, watching, you know, a glory shot compilation of FTL is not the same as actually playing FTL. Or, like, right now I'm playing stuff like Cultist Simulator by Alexis Kennedy. Like, that game is something that if you watch it and there's no dialogue, you will have no idea what the hell is going on in that title. Like, you basically need someone to basically be your tour guide to have any way of learning it.
I think that's exactly right. So based on that, we're kind of hoping that this will turn out to be a very streamer-friendly thing, because you can talk about what it is that you're doing, right? Like, the very first thing that happens when you start a level in Void Bastards, and they're all sort of these derelict spaceships floating out in this nebula. Every time you enter one of them, you don't open your eyes and you're standing there in the airlock. We open up to the map screen of the level so that you can have a think about where you are, where you want to be, what you want to do before you actually get started.
Yep. And, like, going back to your other point about proactive versus being reactive, like, that's one of the things that I see from a lot of people when they play CCGs or any turn-based kind of design, that they spend a long time coming up with, you know, this 18, 20-point plan about what they're going to do over the next, you know, 2 to 3 minutes of play. Like, for me, like, that's never really been my style. I like the improvisation when I play a lot of roguelites or strategy games where, you know, I think about something very quickly and I'm like, okay, I do this, the opponent does that. Now, how am I going to now react to that? Like, I don't come with a plan of, I expect the enemy to do exactly X, Y, and Z, and if they do X, Y, and A, my plan is ruined. Like, I'm always trying to think about, you know, that reaction. I think that's kind of why I've really enjoyed, like, the Souls-like kind of formulas so much, that it's very much that reactive sense. Like, I'm constantly going, okay, what's this person going to do? Now, what's my counterplay to that? And it's just that constant back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's a really big part of a lot of more, I guess, deeper or more creative forms of play. So, for example, let me think. Building stuff in Minecraft, right? Bit of a tangent, but I always found it much easier and much more interesting to look at an environment and think about what gets built there than to just start with a blank slate and then try to build something from nothing. So I think some existing context is really great for sparking ideas and getting you engaged with what's going on and making interesting decisions about what you're doing and how you're playing. Another example, I guess, is one of my games, the Captain Forever series. In those, you build spaceships out of these little modules that you sort of glue together, and then you can fly them around in physics and blow up other stuff. I don't just give you an editor with all of the parts in it. I set the game up so that a ship will fly by with some parts, and if you destroy that ship, you get those parts. And so now there's that limitation immediately, and the question flips from what do I feel like building today, which is a very hard question, to what do I feel like building out of these parts that I've got, which is much, I think, more interesting because it pushes you in different directions, but also very engaging and immediate because you've narrowed down that space, and people can just start fiddling with what's there.
Yeah,
and I think that's why I really like reactive play in a video game rather than here's a blank slate, go make an enormous plan. Oh shit, this feels like work. Fuck it.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna bother.
It's like for me, like the difference between playing, as you said, something like Minecraft versus something like Factorio, where Minecraft is, as you said, it's everything. What do I want to build today? Literally anything I can think of. And then my brain just shuts down because I don't want to spend the next hour creating a plan. But in Factorio, it's like, what do I want to build? I have, this, and this. What can I make with this crazy set of things? And then it just gets bigger and bigger from there. I guess, as a question for you, Farbs, have you played like any games like Infinite Factory or anything from like Zachtronics that kind of go for like these crazy, here's a set of tools, figure out a solution with these tools?
Right. I'm trying to remember. Does Zachtronics do the various programming games as well?
TS, yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah. I play a bunch of those, and yes, they're very great. But yeah, I do find the smaller levels a lot more engaging, right? The longer the challenge and the more work I have to do to get to the solution, the more I'm likely to think, maybe I'll just make a video game instead. Right? Like once it becomes work. And yeah, I think that really is just down to how many components you give the person to play with and how many options there are to get to the solution. I think I see that in a lot of tile-based puzzle games as well. Things like, not exclusively Sokoban games, but that sort of turn-based, tile-based solve a puzzle. With that sort of thing, there's always a possibility space of how much you can do and how far you can go in the wrong direction in those. And I always find the smaller ones much more interesting. Yeah,
because again, you're given the player, or as a player, you're given the freedom to just say, as the adage goes, necessity is the motherhood of all invention. Like, you're able to think about things in terms of, I can only use these pieces. What is my grand plan for them? And I think it's like, for me, like, again, going back to like the Minecraft and that kind of example, that it's why like the open sandbox kind of games just have never really worked for me. Like, I always say this, I need a carrot on the end of the stick. I need some kind of goal to shoot for.
Yeah.
Even if it's, 50 hours ahead of me, I still need to have something to go for rather than just saying, do whatever I want. Because if I'm going to do that, I'm going to go play another game, basically.
Right. Yep.
Let's see.
Yeah, makes sense.
Mojo's asking regarding pricing. Yeah. Like, have you guys settled on a price yet for the game, or it's still up in the air right now?
Yeah, we don't know. How much do you think it should be?
There we go. That question always ends up well for everybody involved.
No, we've been doing a bunch of playtesting, just sort of with people we know or people we sort of vaguely know, and with that we always do a survey at the end. And one of them is, pick a price point. We've got a variety of price points. And when you look at the results of that survey, like the various bars in that bar chart are all the same height. So like nobody knows. Everybody has a completely different opinion,
Of
and
course.
they all hold it very strongly, but they don't agree with each other at all. So
Yep, pretty
I don't know.
much. That's how it always works, I think.
Yeah, pretty much.
Let's see.
I think
And
it will be less than $100. I'll
good.
commit to that. More than zero in most cases.
Uh,
Somewhere in between.
Probably a low percent of it being like negative, right? Like negative $10.
Yeah, we're probably not going to pay a lot of people to play the game.
All right, I see. Storm has a question in chat, and I think that's also a good
Yep.
segue into talking more about combat. So, Storm's
Okay.
question is: will there be character classes with various skills to play with?
That is a good question. That's an excellent question. So, kinda. Um, a thing to know about Void Bastards is um, you're going to die a bit, and that's okay because you're going to keep all of your progress that you've built. But your characters, you're going to cycle through them, and we wanted to keep that interesting. So, a system that we built in there is character traits. So, every time a new character appears, they have 2 to 3 interesting traits about them. And they might be simple things like this one can run faster, or this one has higher hit points, or they might be things like this person has a smoker's cough, and every 15 or so seconds they cough, and any enemies that are nearby are going to hear them and turn around. Um, and yeah, we've got a whole bunch of those, and we apply those to different characters. So they're not a class of character; they're just a somewhat unique character because that's what's interesting and special about them. That said, we don't just lock those on each character, right? There's a thing that we've tried to do is make sure that our spaceships, which are made of all these different modules, pretty much every module is interesting in some way, which means that we have these particular ships that have this one module that allows you to reprogram your characters, right? So you go up to this big, scary-looking machine, and you pull a lever, and in doing so, you've made a decision to replace one of your traits with some other one that the machine has decided to offer you that day. And so you can actually fine-tune and modify your characters to get rid of the smoker's cough and maybe gain the ability to see loot on the minimap. Or maybe you can see enemies on the minimap, which makes planning your way around much, much more interesting. Well, not more interesting. Very different, let's say. And is particularly effective against particular enemies. So, for example, we have this enemy, which is in fact the one that was on your thumbnail that you posted originally, which is the, what do we call it now? I think call it the spook. If you look directly at it, it phases out and then appears again somewhere behind you. Now, if you've got something that's showing you where everybody is on the minimap, you know exactly where it is behind you because it suddenly pops in. And again, that's another example of these systems that we did not think about how they would interact with each other. We just gave them the opportunity to interact with each other, and then they did. So, yeah, no classes, but the characters are quite different from each other in ways that you are also able to modify.
Okay.
And then we even push it into the star map, right? Which is that bit where you're traveling from ship to ship and planning your route. We have these freaky gene twisting things floating around, and if you bump into one of those, then your traits get a little bit scrambled as well. So you have to choose whether you want to burn up some food by sitting in place waiting for it to float past, or if you want to jump on and take a risk that you lose a trait that you really like. Yeah, decisions. So many decisions.
Now, with regards to the characters, that brings up, I think, two questions for me. I guess one is, are you giving the player like freedom to just keep adding or modifying traits? Like, can we have, you know, like the super fast, heavily armored, sneaky, heavy damage kind of guy? Or is there going to be like a limited number of ways for you to modify a character?
Right, so a character can have up to 3 traits.
Okay.
And so when you're hitting this machine, you will often find that it's not offering you a new trait, it's offering to exchange one for another. And part of that is just that we wanted to keep things sane so that the balance didn't get completely blown out and the game just became trivially easy if you had all the good traits and none of the bad ones. And And also part of it is that we want to make sure that if you die, you don't lose too much, right? We don't want somebody building up the perfect character that's this ultimate unkillable thing, and then they accidentally get eaten by a void whale or something, and then they just rage quit the game.
Let's see. Storm is asking, how big is the star map for Void Bastards?
Big is an interesting question. Because I'm on video, right?
Yeah.
It's about as big as your screen, and then when you move, we generate the next bit. So, it's 5 screens high, and each screen is like a rail of 3 sets of ships. So it's sort of like, it doesn't look like a grid, but underlying in a sneaky way it sort of is. So it's about 15 ships high or deep, and then it's as far that way as you feel like going.
And I do want to ask you a few questions about the strategic side of things, but keeping with combat, one thing that I've been thinking about as you were describing kind of the various enemies and some of the strategies, in terms of like the first person shooting, does the player have like, I'm not sure how to describe this, but we see in some first person shooters the player has, 100 points of health, 300 points of health, like a lot of ability to soak up damage, and then some games go for like smaller. Let's say you have 5 points of max health, each hit will guarantee you to 1 point. Like, where's like Void Bastards fall in terms of, I guess, that kind of like combat or defensive side of things?
Right. So part of the answer to that is that it depends a lot on how you want to play. So, like I said, we regenerate your characters and come up with new ones, and some of the traits do affect how many hit points you have. But as well, we've got this system of things that you're building in order to make yourself more capable, and there's a whole track of, I just need more HP, I'm going to focus on that. So if people do find that they're just dying too quickly for their tastes, then that's something that they can immediately see as a goal, set as a goal for themselves. They can tell the star map to go and help them find the parts that they need in order to build the various kinds of armor to help them out with that. So I would say in our earliest prototypes, you could get shot maybe 3 times, and then that was it. And that was interesting, right? It created a very tense game. But I think we quickly found that wasn't something for everyone, right? And so we've softened it a bit. But it's also a game where, as you sink deeper into the nebula, you find more and more powerful enemies to fight against, and you go deeper based on really how comfortable you feel at various depths. So people are really able to set their own level of challenge in that sense. If they feel like they're not strong enough with their playstyle and the upgrades that they have right now to attempt something deeper, then they can just hang out for a bit and level up their characters before they go down. It's your classic sort of RPG approach to difficulty balancing, which is go as fast as you like. Yeah.
Okay. And I think continuing on that point, actually, before we do that, just to clarify for people watching, because I think you mentioned this, with regard to the actual derelicts themselves, it is all going to be procedurally built in terms of the various environments.
No.
Okay.
That was something that we had assumed we would do when we first started working on the game. We were like, oh yeah, the ships are made of these different parts, and we'll just like build a system that jumbles them together at runtime. But what we realized really quickly is that learning the different layouts to the ships is in itself very interesting, and knowing, all right, I'm on this class of ship, and so we have like a few dozen ships. And they vary internally a little bit about, maybe this door is broken this time, or it's not broken, or maybe there's a wall here that's not always there. And the biggest difference we've actually seen is maybe you enter through this airlock, or this one, 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 and maybe you want to pick up a part that's over here, or maybe you're here to go over to this part of the ship, or whatever. So you end up traveling all sorts of different routes through the ship each time you go in. But you start to learn the layouts and learn how they fit together, which I think gives a really nice sense of mastery of, oh, I know this one. I know where I'm going. I know what I'm doing. So we change a lot of the context for what's happening in the ships. So, you know, where you start, where you might want to go, what types of enemies are inside it changes each time, all that sort of thing. We have, as well as character traits, we have ship traits, so different just overall global modifiers for the ships are going to change. But the actual just core layout of here's where security is, engines are at the back, helms at the front, and there's a habitation deck over here. If you go into that class of ship again, it will be the same.
Okay. And I think that's a really good point there, Farbs, because it's one of the things I think we see a lot in terms of trying to balance out procedural or randomly generated content, that the layout isn't what's going to be interesting in Void Bastards, it's what you're doing within the ship that is going to change and require you to react to it. It kind of reminds me, as you were describing, of something like The Binding of Isaac, that they use, again, hard-coded rooms so that, you know, when you walk into a room, you know exactly what the layout is, but what enemies are going to show up, what items you could possibly get, that's all, you know, completely up to chance each time you play.
Yeah, right. I think another example that sort of shows how we think about the levels and what they mean is that a few times we found ourselves talking about Pac-Man, because in a sense, sometimes our levels do work out as mazes, right? You've got these wandering monsters looking for you. You're in there as well, trying to snaffle up all of the various resources that you want to pick up. And it does, to some degree, play like a first-person maze game.
All right. And we'll get to Mojo's question from a few minutes in a few minutes over here, but one thing that I wanted to touch on, we haven't mentioned yet, are the actual weapons, or what kind of tactics the player has. So I guess, again, if without spoiling things too much, like, what exactly are you, like, looking for, aiming for, in terms of, I guess, weapon or, I guess, tactical diversity in the game?
As in, what are we as a studio aiming for?
Yeah, like, what kind of options, like, are you looking at, like, giving the player? Like, again, as we've said, it's not going to be a straight shooter. You're not going to just run around with a double-barrel shotgun and kill everything in one hit.
Right. That said, we do have a shotgun. Right, because, you know, sometimes that is an interesting way to approach something, is to pick the shotgun and run around with it. So, I guess it's a little bit tangential, but it's worth talking about now. We have our loadout system, which I think is something we came up with very early that we're really, very, very happy with. In a lot of games, if your character has access to 15 weapons, then you walk into the level and you've got all 15 weapons, and you bounce between your favorite ones, and when they run out of ammo, you pick the next one. We don't do that. We do in fact have 15 things that you can build and work with, but we have them in 3 different slots. So your first slot will be your primary weapon, and so that'll be, it starts with simple things, right? You start with a pistol, and then we work to a shotgun, and then we work to more interesting things, like I'm really fond of our laser weapon, which can fire through glass. Which, if you think about it, spaceships, windows, all kinds of interesting things can come out of that, right? Like I remember watching a playtest head out all the way out to the wing of a ship, and thinking, you don't need to go there. There's nothing for you there. But actually, what they'd done is they'd locked a few enemies into the helm right at the front of the ship. Then they ran out to the wing, looked through the window of the wing, back in through the windows of the helm, and then sniped them through the windows, which was awesome. Like, we'd thought about it as, you know, a lot of our doors have a window, but they thought on a whole other level. How did I get here? What am I talking about?
Weapon diversity?
The slot system.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so that's our first slot. The next one is more like secondary weapons, so it's things like indirect stuff. It's grenades, so you can think about how you can bounce something to where you want it to be without having to expose yourself to fire from something. Or it's things like mines. It's dart guns that don't alert the enemy but slowly poison them. It's things that set up radiation traps. It's that kind of stuff. And then the third slot, we have really pushed for stuff you don't use to do damage to enemies. You just use to affect the world. And so it starts out really simple with the Zapper, which is like a short-ish range stun weapon. And then we move on through things like a shield that reflects projectiles. And so you can use that to, like, you find one enemy firing super powerful projectiles at you, and then you use the shield to redirect those projectiles at the other enemies that are coming at you from a different direction. Things like that. There's the Rifter, which I think I mentioned before, which is about just rearranging where stuff is in the level. And at the very base level, you can just go, there is one big scary monster in this ship. I'm going to suck it up into the Rifter, and then it's going to stay there. I'm good. But you can only fit one thing in there, right? So something else comes up. You need to find somewhere to stash this character. And so you might like lock a tiny little cupboard somewhere and jam them in there while you go deal with... Yeah, stuff happens. And so, yeah, that's sort of our approach. It's been... We don't want people not to shoot stuff, right? Because running around shooting things can be fun. So we've got a slot dedicated to that. We want people thinking about other interesting ways to defeat the enemy. So we've got a slot dedicated to that. And then we want people just doing crazy shit. And so we've got a slot dedicated to that. And so every ship before you jump on, you go through this loadout screen, you pick one thing for each, and then that's what you've got for the ship. And if it turns out you made a bad choice, then you need to find ways to make that work. Or you can turn around and leave. But if you went onto that ship because you ran out of food or fuel, then you are in a slightly tighter situation. You really need to go find those things.
And Storm and Blue is asking some questions regarding kind of like the overall goals of the game. We'll get to that in a few minutes when we talk more about the strategic side. But keeping with the combat portion, like as you said, like having that loadout is important, because if the player finds like two weapons they really like, they're just going to use the same things again and again and again, and they're not going to care about all your other cool stuff. I guess with the items, I think this may actually also kind of be somewhat tangent for right now. Like, I guess, will the player, like, the weapons that they bring to levels, do they have infinite ammo, or do they have fixed numbers of or a fixed pool?
Right. That's been another really important thing for us in the design of this game is, yeah, very definitely fixed ammo counts for everything. And the reason we want to do that is that, like, it is easy to get used to just using one tool to do everything. But it tends to be less fun. Even if it's your favorite thing, you can get sick of your own favorite thing, and then you just kind of feel like you're sick of the game. So what we try and do is have ammo balanced at such a point where if you do use a particular weapon or tool a couple of times, then you're going to be so low on ammunition for it that you're going to want to bounce to a different one. And so we use ammo scarcity as a way of encouraging the player to really switch up what they're doing. Another way we address that is with each new character that we generate, we give them ammo for some of their weapons. And we change that up each time. And so that really kind of just gets you out of your comfort zone, responding to threats in different ways and trying new stuff. So again, it's part of that whole reactive, here's a situation that's encouraging you to try something new.
And in terms of the actual like levels of the ships you're going into, what's kind of like the average amount of time that you estimate someone should like be in a level 4?
We see people hang out in levels for about 5 to 10 minutes most of the time. And so, yeah, we really wanted that feeling of that reasonably high tempo. I don't feel like when I sit down to play Void Bastards, I'm committed for the next 3 hours because I need to play the whole 3 hours. It's like I'm going to jump in and do a ship, and then I'm going to do the washing up. And maybe I'll jump in and do another ship, or maybe I'll do 3. But I'm only really committing to just one. And I think that's worked out really well. And it's also nice to get that tempo of bouncing back into the star map layer and thinking about your goals in the workbench, and sort of just that back and forth between the different aspects of the game, I think, really keeps things moving.
Get in, get out. Don't spend a lot of time, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So you can. I think I mentioned that there is an oxygen system
mhm.
that encourages people
Yes.
to keep in motion, and that again was one of those things where we found very quickly, great, that's something we can now mess with. So nearly every ship also has an atmosphere module. So you'll be running around on a ship, and maybe you got a bit distracted and took a bit longer than usual on this one, and then you hear the beep beep beep. You know, you've got 30 seconds left, and 30 seconds sounds disastrous, but actually you can go a long way in 30 seconds in most games. And in
Mhm.
this one, yeah, usually that's like, all right, do I want to keep pressing towards this side goal that I'm thinking of there's probably food in that room, but do I even need food right now? Or do I want to jump back? Like, and in order to do that, I should probably jump back and get some extra oxygen and then come back again. Or do I want to just bug out and leave the level? Or do I want to push through and lose a little bit of health by choking for a little bit when I run out of air? Like, it's just these decisions just keep piling up at you.
Mhm.
And yeah, there's often several pretty reasonable answers.
Now, switching gears for a second, on the other side of combat we haven't discussed yet, really is the enemy designs. You've mentioned, of course, the enemy who can appear behind the player. In
Yeah.
terms of kind of like the enemies that you're planning for Void Bastards, like, I guess, what has been like the general philosophy? Because we see in a lot of action or roguelike based titles, there's a very wide array of enemies you can build. You can build enemies who are immune to all damage, and your only option is to get around them. You can
Right.
create enemies that are resistant to certain tactics, and you have to plan around those accordingly. So, I guess, what are you
Mhm.
aiming for with the game?
Yeah, right. Well, our approach to it was pretty simple, and I think it kind of it how we approached it probably explains what we were aiming for. And it was basically this. One, we just started with a grunt, right? A completely vanilla. This is our janitor. He walks around a bit. Sometimes he stops. Then he starts walking around a bit. If he sees you, then he starts firing and chasing you and trying to track you down. Very simple, right? But it was enough to sort of bootstrap working on the rest of the game and thinking about it all. And from there, we've really tried to make every other thing be interesting in terms of how it interacts with the tools that you have, how it interacts with the environments, and just come up with cool stuff that's going to really push how you think about and play the game. So, I guess some good examples are the tourist who's gone through sort of matter teleporters a few too many times and now just this little gelatinous blob slurping its way along the levels. If you get too close to that thing, it explodes. It's basically, your classic video game red barrel, except it's on legs and it wanders around. And in later levels, it actually chases you. So, with that, that's immediately interesting because A, it's small, so now it's one of the few enemies that's able to make its way through the ducts that are occasionally found at floor level in the game, whereas a lot of other enemies just can't get through there. It's something you can use to set off chain reactions. Like you could see a line of them and then some other enemy at the end. You shoot the one at the start, that blows up the next one, which hits the next one, which hits the enemy. It's great. You can rift them up and now suddenly it's a little portable bomb. That's great, right? You walk up close enough to it that it starts vibrating, it's about to explode, then you rift it. So now it's primed. And then you walk up to another enemy, and just before they get to you through a doorway, you slam the door closed, so now you're protected. You rift the thing through the door, and then it blows up and hits both of them, right? So, I don't know, it's one of my favorites. But yeah, I talked about the ghost, which is something that tries to get behind you and attack you, but if you see it front on, it just fades out and disappears, and then it is again behind you. We've got what do we end up calling it? The scribe, who will shoot at you and run away. And so you'll find quite often you'll enter a room, and if there's one of those, take a couple of shots, run away before you get a chance to get at it. And so you have to really push to get to them, or sneak up behind them, or avoid the places that they're going, things like that. I think probably my favorite, though, is very similar to one that you mentioned, and it's the Screw. It's the big prison guard who stomps around the place. And that character, at the start of the game, when you first start playing, you probably just won't be able to kill it. Like, it is just too powerful. But it's very slow. And so it's like you're playing Pac-Man with a very slow-moving ghost, right? And so you're thinking about where it's going, where you're leading it, which bits of the level it's basically denying you access to, and trying to manage that. And so yeah, it's always just been what's going to be interesting to play against. Yeah, and so we end up with things like the swarm, which is this floating swarm of body parts and heads that area of effect damage is great against. But if you go at it with a pistol, you've got to shoot every single one of those heads, and that's going to take forever, right? And so now you've got to think about which tools are appropriate. But if you can lead it through a radiation hazard, that's perfect. Or, because it doesn't have any hands, you can just close the door. You don't even need to lock it. It just kind of...
Yeah, works like just like that.
Yeah, done.
I guess one interesting question I have for you regarding the enemy designs. Are you thinking about doing like anything in terms of, you mentioned of course the levels will have modifiers or global modifiers to them. Are you thinking about doing any kind of like enemy modifiers, like a speedy modifier? Maybe this enemy's on fire, maybe this enemy does poison, stuff like that?
Okay. I think one of the reasons we haven't pushed on that direction, like we have quite a few classes of enemies, but we want players to be able to read very quickly what they're up against and what they're doing. So we haven't really pushed on that side of things too much. There are a couple of states that are interesting, like later in the game you can, what's the word we use for it? You can mez an enemy, like you can basically confuse them and confound them into being on your side. So there's things like that. You can make them source of radiation, I think. That sort of thing. But for the most part, we just wanted them to read very quickly. This is who this is and what they're doing. There is a system in place where sometimes one enemy on a ship will be much more powerful than all the others.
Okay.
But that's just a rare ship trait that just sometimes happens. Yeah.
And, what was the question I was about to have? Let's see, the enemies, stealth. Yeah. You mentioned, of course, being able to sneak around the enemies and such. Like, how does, I guess, stealth work in Void Bastards? Like, is this a case where if an enemy sees you, everybody gets alerted? Or are you giving, like, the player a lot in terms of, like, stealth tactics?
Right. So, I think I like to think of it not as a stealth game, but like an anti-stealth game. That makes sense? Or it's not like we have stealth systems, we have anti-stealth systems. So you can walk around and that doesn't make any noise that alerts the enemies. But if you run, then we show these big stink lines coming off the ground as you slam your feet onto the ground, and the enemies can hear that. If you fire a weapon that's not, a particularly quiet weapon, like if it's not the dart gun, then they're going to hear that and they're going to respond to that. But each enemy is independent of all the others.
Okay.
So they have their own awareness of what's happening in the world. If they think there's a threat somewhere that they need to deal with or not, what their current plan is for what they're trying to do, how they're behaving right now. And so, yeah, it's not that once combat starts, everybody files in, unless you're making a hell of a racket and all the doors are open. So again, doors, super important part of Void Bastards. You leave a door open, people are going to hear stuff through it. Close the door, they're not.
And
yeah.
One thing I just remembered, the other question I had for you: do enemies respawn in levels in Void Bastards, or they're dead? They're dead.
They do, and that's another one of those things that keeps the pressure on. I think it's not that they respawn; it's that we have spawning goopy places where they keep sort of getting spawned out of, and there's nothing you can do to shut those off. So again, that's one of those things that keeps the pressure on, but not a super high amount of pressure. Especially because if you identify them, quite often the thing to do is to, I guess maybe like subvert a turret next to it. And now every time someone spawns, they get attacked by a turret. Or just lock them in the room, or various things like that. Or you can just lay a mine there, and you know that the next one that comes out is going to go bang.
Does it mean that, does the level just spawn enemies endlessly, or does it know to spawn, let's say, a total of 6 enemies, or 12 enemies, or stuff like that?
I don't remember. um, I think certainly our first implementation would have been just do it endlessly. And the only reason we would have undone that would be because it was getting ridiculous or because, um, yeah, no, ridiculous either for gameplay or performance reasons. But I'm pretty sure we just left it like that, where they just keep coming out.
All right. And this was a question Mojo asked, like 80 minutes ago when we first started this, but we're finally getting to it. Are there like boss class enemies in Void Bastards?
Right, right. So I think, as I mentioned before, there's the screw, right, which is this big hulking thing, and you're going to see before you go into a level, hey, there are a few screws here, or there are a shit ton of screws in this one, and you'll think about whether you want to go on a ship because of who's on there. But it's not that we call something out and say this one's a boss and this one's not. It's more that as you go deeper into the nebula, we'll introduce new enemies, and each time we introduce a new one, it's probably because it's a bit harder than the things you've been facing. And sometimes they'll be a lot harder, sometimes they'll be a little bit harder. And so it's more that we just introduce new things, and as stuff gets introduced, that usually tends to be a bit of a difficult spike in itself. Okay. Not only as you just encounter something that's been tuned a little harder, but also as you encounter something for the first time and go, I don't know what this is. How am I going to deal with it? Develop your strategies for it.
What is this thing? Let me shoot it a few times and see what happens.
Right. Oh, I just thought of a different system we have, though, that is a bit like a boss monster. As you're flying around the star map, especially once you get beyond the first safer depth, right, into the real thick of it, you'll find these little purple spaceships flying the opposite direction to you. And if you and they hit the same location, they will start tracking you and following you. And when you go into a ship next, they will come into the ship as well. And they are hard. They're there's something to avoid. Because, yeah, in order to get back to your ship, you need to go and find the point where they've cut a hole in and entered into this other ship that you're in, and then release their tether and things. And meanwhile, they're all tracking you down. They have the special ability of always knowing where you are. Right, like most NPCs, they don't know about you when you come into the level. If they're not facing you when you walk into a room, they don't know you're there. And even if they do see you, then if you run away and they can't find you, they will forget and wander off, right? These things do not do that. They know where you are. They come straight at you. It's hard. So they're kind of like a boss monster.
Alright. Will, like, lower tier enemies get, like, boosted up? Like, if you're, like, let's say, like, a tier 1 ship, you go and you fight, like, the lower class enemies. Will those lower class enemies appear in, let's say, like, a tier 5 or a tier 6 ship? Or will you just replace those with just, like, higher class enemies?
Right, so yeah, we do cycle things out and cycle them in again, and we do have several levels of some of them. So yeah, okay. Your janitor and your gremlin, which is sort of like one of our popcorn enemies. It's just these, wait, gremlin's not the right word, we changed it. Juveniles. So they're short, they're obnoxious, they run around really fast and scream at you and shoot at you, but they don't take many hits. And yeah, they'll be higher level later in the game, but that's really more to match the expected player progression as you build up your upgrades and make your own weapons more powerful, so they don't just become trivial.
Okay. And I guess here's one thing that I wanted to ask just in the back of my head. Like, as we've said before, the major part of Void Bastards is the fact that it's about getting the resources on each ship. Will enemies ever drop resources or loot, or would that kind of conflict with that system?
Right. They do drop some amount of stuff. So, depending on which type of NPC you've attacked, they might drop different things. For the most part, they drop ammunition because that sort of balances out the I spent ammunition, so I'd like some back now. But yeah, they do drop, like, quite often. You'll blow up a janitor and you'll find his finger on the ground, and you'll pick that up, and that'll be useful later. Things like that.
All right then.
Yep.
Let me see. I guess with that said, I'm thinking we'll move on talking more about the strategic or the persistent level or layer of
Mhm.
Void Bastards next. So, for you, Farbs, are there any aspects relating to combat or the first person gameplay that we didn't touch on that you'd like to bring up now?
Uh, I feel like I'll probably end up diving back in there as we discuss other things anyway.
Okay.
So, like, it's such an interconnected game
Yeah.
that we'll definitely get back there.
All right. And as a quick time check, we have just hit the hour and a half mark for the stream. So
Wow.
yeah, it
It's a
still
long
feels like nothing. No. And for people watching us live right now, we had on Joe McDonough, who was one of the designers on Card Hunters. He was on an audio cast. This was like year one of Game Wisdom. That cast went for like almost like 3.5 hours. Like we were of the two of us talking. So we're not going to hit that much. I can tell you that right now. But I figure in terms of length, we'll probably aim for maybe another 20 to 30 minutes. I think, and then we'll begin to wrap things up. I think that should be about that time.
Sure.
So,
Whatever you want.
all right, you may come to regret that decision there, but we'll see. But
Well, I think what you need to keep in mind is that we worked on this game in secret for 3 years, right?
mhm,
Which means that there's a whole lot of talking about this game that's just pent up, and
nice.
we want to let it out.
All right. Well, I am definitely the guy here to help you out with that. So, this we have a few questions from chat that came up like 20, 30 minutes ago that were more persistent layer. So we'll be getting to
Okay.
those as well here. So, like we've said, when it comes to Void Bastards, you have on one side the first person combat going to the ships getting resources, and then that all ties into this persistent layer of exploring the nebula. So
Mm-hmm.
we got a lot of questions here. So let's give us some that were asked earlier. So Storm asks, what is the final goal of the game? Like, what is the player doing in Void Bastards at this layer?
Right. Okay. I'm going to spoil the story a little bit, but not very much. Um, Basically, your ship that you're on, it's a prison transport ship, and you play as a series of those prisoners who are just these little dehydrated packets in little baggies, who just stacked on a shelf, who get rehydrated and thrown into the nebula as the ship's computer realizes it needs to send one person after the other to unshipwreck your ship, if that makes sense, right? You've just kind of been jammed in this thing. You're trying to get out. You're trying to repair the ship to get home. So I'm trying to remember what the first thing you need to build is. Oh, yep, no, I got it. Right. The first thing you do as the character is, all right, your job is to go and restart the FTL drive. All right, go press the button. Beep. ID card required. You don't have an ID card. So your first mission really is to go and get a laminator and an ID card and forge something that the ship's computer will accept in order to allow you to jump out. And of course that's just your first of the 5 depths of the game. And that doesn't work because the ID card hasn't been properly authorized yet. So you need to go to the HR computer and fix it. But the HR computer is right. And it's just this, it's a series of just horrible, I just want to go home. Why won't you let me go home? Bureaucracy is the answer. Just
It, it reminds me, did you play West of Loathing by any chance?
I haven't played that yet, but I have been meaning to.
There's one
You recommend?
section that is just the nightmare of bureaucracy. I'm not going to spoil it here, but it sounds exactly what's in Void Bastards.
Right.
And I guess this may kind of, you may have already answered this, but Blue Rain's question is, how significant is the story in the game?
Right. I mean, a game doesn't need to have a story, right? But it's often a lot stronger for it. It just gives you a lot of context for why stuff is happening, and it adds a lot of color to the world. And I think that's kind of how we've treated it, right? Like, it's, you don't have to follow the story at all if you don't want to, but it's there, and it's kind of fun. We've got Kevin Brighting, the narrator from Stanley Parable,
Nice.
is doing voice acting for our ship's computer and sort of guiding you through, except not really because he's particularly unhelpful. And yeah, so it's there. The game, I guess, for the most part, the development hasn't been about developing the deepest story. We certainly had fun with it, Um, but our primary focus has been on system design.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Storm asks, will there be difficulty levels in Void Bastards?
Yes, there absolutely definitely will. And in fact, I think just yesterday we started talking about achievements, and we'll probably hook up an achievement for completing the game at each difficulty level and things like that. And one of the things we wanted to really do with that is create a huge spectrum, like not a lot of notches on the difficulty levels. I think we've only set up 5, but the difference between the lowest and the highest difficulty level is nuts. Like, only one person has got through the highest difficulty level so far, because it's hard. And really, I don't think you need to try very hard at all for most people to get through on the easiest. So yes, very definitely. That's something we want to do. That's something we're doing. It's something we've done.
I guess without spoiling it too much, like what factors are going to be tweaked in between each difficulty level?
Yeah, that's been really interesting. Is trying to figure out what you can tweak without messing up the gameplay, right? Because, for instance, a really easy thing you can do is just say, okay, well, all of the enemies take 10 times as much damage,
exactly,
or 1/10 as much damage, but that changes how they play, and that can really blow out the game experience. So we had that's one that we have very deliberately not messed with. But you can more easily mess with things like how much damage the player can take, or how much damage the enemy attacks are going to do, or how much oxygen you have when you get on board a ship, how much ammunition we drop, things like that. That's more been what our focus is. We want to change things to make it harder, but without changing the moment to moment all that much.
Yeah, and I think that's a very wise strategy there, because, like you said, I've seen many RPGs that just say, "Oh, you want to play on hard? Every enemy has like 5 times more health, and now the game takes like 10 to 15 times longer to go through. Enjoy."
Yeah, but it's not actually harder because you're still healing yourself at the same rate as you're taking damage, and we don't want to do that.
Yep.
So yeah, now we've definitely put some thought into it. Tried to keep it fun. And in fact, we've also very deliberately been playing. We figured that internally in the studio, we've been playing this game since the first prototype, 3 years ago. We know it very well. We have our strategies down. We're reasonably competent players just in general in video games. So we exclusively play on hard, and try and balance it so that hard is right for us, theorizing that makes normal more appropriate for somebody who doesn't know the game yet.
Now, bring back to the strategic layer. Over the cast so far, you've talked about, again, gathering resources, making sure things are staying alive and stuff like that. So, at the strategic portion, like, what is the player actually like managing? Like, what are the factors they're dealing with?
Right. When you say the strategic part, do you mean explicitly
like the
when they're
star
on
map?
the star map?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, I guess I can talk you through some of the resources that we have and the sorts of decisions that get made as a result of that.
Okay.
Well, let's just go through it from the top. So we have parts, and everything that you want to build will be built out of a series of parts. So you might need a CO2 scrubber and I can't remember what the various things are, and a stapler in order to build the staple gun, which is our shotgun, right? And so those parts are like a major objective in each ship that you might visit, and you'll see on the star map what objectives are available on each one, and track them back through to the upgrades in order to make a plan for where you want to go and why. If you don't have a part, you can construct it out of what we're calling materials, and so that's things like I think we've called them names like plaz and volts and stuff like that. So it's like your plastic and your steel and your energy and your data and your bio, that kind of thing, right? And so part of that is just, if you end up with duplicates of parts that you don't need, then you can recycle back into materials and pull them back out. And it also allows us to sprinkle a lot of interesting stuff in the level, like when you pick up somebody's finger or their head, or when you just find some random stuff lying around on the ground. it allows us to just see a lot of secondary objectives throughout a ship. So you can pick up these materials and you can use them to short circuit and jump ahead a little bit in building your upgrades. From there, we have, now you've jumped into the star map in my mind. And the most obvious thing there is the interplay between food and fuel, which I think has come out really, really well. Every time you either choose to rest at a location or travel to a new location, some amount of time goes past. And in most cases, that's 1 day. And in 1 day, you can either automatically consume 1 unit of food, which is going to boost up your health, or you can starve for that day, which is going to cost you some health, depending on whether or not you have any food. So food, you don't have to have it all the time, but you probably want to have it as much. So you might be on a ship, you're aware that you've run out of food, you see that there's a big bad monster between you and where the food's going to be, you think, I'm going to lose some health if I fight this thing to try and get the food, but then I'm going to lose some health if I don't get the food. Which one's going to be bigger? Split-second decision, make a choice, run with it. And again, we're back in the levels. Fuel, on the other hand, if you want to do just a jump of one ship to the next ship linked to it, then that's going to cost you 1 unit of fuel, and that's pretty simple, right? But what happens when you run out? We don't want to just have the player stuck and just call game over at that point, right? And so for a long time in the earlier prototypes, we would just lock the player in the level until they had a unit of fuel. It's like, no, you can't go anywhere. And that was a little bit frustrating. We wanted a simpler, a softer system, I guess. And so what we came up with was the concept of drifting, which takes several days. So even if you've run out of fuel, you can still drift to the next location. But instead of just 1 day going past, it's going to be like, I think it might be set to 5 days at the moment. It's where we balance that out. And so you might eat 5 days of food, which is fine, but now you've got a lot less food. Or you might eat for 2 days and then starve for 3, and then that can be disastrous, right? And so that's sort of a really nice interplay there of you want both of those things, you don't need technically both of those things, and you want to try and balance out your resources there. We've also dropped in warp keys, which are a bit rarer, but they're still around, which allows you to, in the space of a single day, just jump to anywhere on the screen, which is great if you can see that you're here and there's only one jump point available from where you are, and there's a pirate ship sitting there. And you don't want to mess with the pirate ship, you can just jump straight past them. But it means that you missed the opportunity to go into the ship in the middle, which is maybe why you were there in the first place. I don't know. Again, systems. So yeah, that's kind of where that sort of starts to work out. Then there's things like torpedoes. So maybe you have a torpedo, in which case that will automatically fire if you touch the pirate or the whale. But in order to get those, you have to go into a particular type of ship and go into a particular module where you're going to go find them. What else is going on in there? You've got merits, which is like our currency. How good a citizen have you been? You can spend that to do things like subvert turrets and security robots and purchase things or unlock extra abilities on the different terminals in the ships. Like you can get even more oxygen or another turn at the trait changing machine, or be able to see where all the enemies are on the map at the map terminal in the helm, stuff like that. What else do we have? And then we have ammo. So, you know, every of our 15 different weapons has its own unique ammunition. There's nothing shared between any two weapons. And so that sort of just allows you to determine how many times you're going to get to use each one. And then those different kinds of ammo are going to drop in different ships. And so you might go to a ship simply because you want to pick up a particular kind of ammunition. And so you go into that particular ship, go into the particular modules in that ship where you expect to find it, pick those up, run out, now go into the next ship, which has the enemies that need to be attacked using the weapon that needed the ammo from the previous ship. Yeah, stuff ties together.
All right. And I guess to clarify, so does your health like recover when you're done with a level, or is it persistent across like how many times you're using that character?
It's persistent with the character.
Okay.
So, yeah, in order to start the next level, you're going to need to travel, and that's going to either boost or drop your health, depending on whether you're eating or starving. But yeah, it's persistent. And so, yeah, another kind of ship you want to visit is a hospital ship, right? Just to, you're almost dead. You want to just get in there, get some free healing, and bounce out.
And as you were describing the interplay between fuel and food, I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that there's never a point in Void Bastards where the player can quote unquote lose. Like, you're not planning to have like a game over screen, like the player just keeps failing consistently.
Yeah, in fact, I don't think we even ever thought about the words game over in the context of this game. It's more that you jump to the new prisoner being rehydrated screen.
Okay.
And then you learn about their new traits and what they got in their care package, and off you go.
Right. Now, in terms of like persistent upgrades, you've mentioned, of course, being able to create new weapons. Are there what other aspects can the player kind of create long term that's going to persist from character to character?
That's been interesting, because we started approaching that with like everything we can think of we will put in that bucket. And what we found was that actually there are some things that you should just give the player at the start, right? So, for example, I was talking about looking at a ship on the star map and seeing what enemies are inside it and choosing your loadout and making a plan for whether to go in there based on who's there. That information was something we were hiding originally behind one of these upgrades. It's like, you have to build the monster scanner, because we hadn't thought of a real name for it yet. And the game just was less fun without this thing. So I thought, no, fuck it, we'll just put it in from the start and think of something else. So yeah, there's I would say between a half and a third maybe of the things that you can build are things that aren't new weapons or upgrades to existing weapons or tools. So it's things like the ability to subvert turrets and security robots. It's things like just being able to lock and unlock doors much more quickly, which is particularly helpful. It's things like just boosting your health, or sometimes not consuming food over the course of a day, or getting more stuff in your initial care package when you start a new character. It's things like extra lives we've even thrown in there. So when a character dies, we go to a screen for 1 to 2 seconds, and then that character pops back in again. And you've got your health back and you keep playing, which is always lovely when it happens. So I always forget that I built it, and then suddenly, bing, I'm back. There's resistance to different hazards that you'll find in the ship, so ability to survive radiation a little more effectively, stuff like that. Just things, any number that looks, tweak it, threw it in there, and any system that we didn't have to have turned on at the start, we added the ability to unlock and turn on later.
And again, it goes back to what you're saying, by the fact that an expert player may not need to get every single upgrade, but somebody who's struggling, they can just keep doing missions, and kind of build themselves up over the course of how long they want to play.
Yeah, that's right. And they'll find that if they go deeper into the nebula, then they'll have more opportunities to build themselves up. So there's always that incentive to go deeper, right? You don't want to have the player incentivized to just do the really easy stuff at the top until they have the ultimate character and then just blast through. That's no fun. And so you can definitely build your character up faster if you go deeper. So there's that incentive to go down, but it's not a requirement. It's not a hard limit.
Okay. And when you say go deeper in the nebula, is this like a story consideration, or can the player choose like what tier of a mission to do, like right from the get-go?
Right. So when I say go deeper in the nebula, I mean when you choose the next ship, sometimes it's down a bit, or sometimes it's up a bit. And if you go down far enough, you go through this little barrier into the next depth, and you'll find there that the mix of ships will be different, the enemies will be different, and some of them will be a bit harder. The parts that we're dropping will be a little bit different. And so it's not that there's like this big story beat and now you're at level 2 in the next depth of the nebula. It's that you went there. That said, when you build the big sort of story progress upgrades, your main objectives, then the Void Ark, which is your prison ship that you're spawning from each time you start a new character, that will move down into the next depth.
Okay.
Just sort of as a little bit of time saving, so you don't have to go all the way from the start, all the way down to the bottom each time in the later runs.
Okay. Now, one thing that we didn't touch on, I want to bring up, in terms of like replayability with Void Bastards, like, are you
Mhm.
aiming this to be like a kind of like a single play? You know, when the person beats the game, you know, that's it, or do you see there being like replayability and like new content or stuff like that that they may run into on another playthrough?
Yeah, right. So at the moment, we're mostly focused on it being, I think it's around, depending on how you play, like a 12 to 20 hour single playthrough,
Hmm.
and that's our main focus. But we definitely have um, the the difficulty level system, and we've seen playtesters finish the game, go, "That was great. I reckon I can hard." You know, we've had people putting 40, 50 hours into this game. Um, and of course, we'll have achievements for the different difficulty levels just to recognize that and
Hmm.
say, yeah, well done. You did really well. But in terms of variation between them, it's more that we think about variation within a single playthrough than
Okay.
focusing on variation between the different playthroughs, because the whole thing is so long, right? We don't want it to feel like the same hour of content over 12 to 20 hours. We want it to feel like 12 to 20 hours of content. And so that's really been our focus. Um, we might think about DLC or something at some point, but we're really focused at the moment on just that one playthrough. And if you want to run through it again because you like it and want to try it harder, then that's great. Go for it. Have fun.
All right. Let me see. We're about to hit the 2 hour mark, and I think I am just about out of questions. You did
Okay.
answer the point about DLC expansion related stuff. I guess had there been any thought about having like expansions or post release support, or is that still too early to tell right now?
That's something we've talked about a bit, but we haven't planned in any hard way. So I think our an idea we have about how we might approach that, certainly not something we're committed to, is something along the lines of adding some new tools or some new upgrades and some new enemies, and having the option to sort of turn those on and change the mix of what's in the game. And I think a few games have done that
Mm-hmm.
pretty well. Is just, rather than replace the whole game or anything like that, just sort of change what's in the mix and have that be something you can turn on. So that's an approach we might take. Um, but honestly, we're really focused on that first playthrough, and that's what we really want to get right at the moment.
All right. So I guess my final question regarding the strategic or the star map layer, and then we'll begin to wrap things up. Are there
Mm-hmm.
any aspects that we didn't talk about that you want to discuss now?
Um, I guess we haven't talked about the fact that there are non-level locations on the star
Okay.
map. And I think that's just something we saw in FTL that we really liked. Like, here's a place you can go where you're not fighting things, you're doing something else. Um, and so that's something we've got in there, right? And they're mostly very simple events. Like, if you go here, you're going to get some food. If you go here, somebody's going to steal all your food, but you get a part. Stuff like that. And that they've been fun to sort of give people a bit more time in the star map, and some more things to do while they're there. Um, yeah, it's just another one of those systems.
All right. And Mike asked in chat, any thoughts on
Mhm.
the recent announcements regarding like a game developers union? I know they just said something about that in the UK.
Yeah, right. That is definitely something that I'm interested in, and I keep up with it myself. It's not clear to me if that would apply in any particular way within Blue Manchu, because I don't think any of us are employees. So unionization isn't going to do very much. We all sort of negotiate our own working arrangements, and how we're going to work within the team. Um, and so, yeah, I'll definitely be keeping a track of it in case I end up in a big studio again someday. But for the moment, it's, I'm there because we talked about what I would get in return for being there, and that seemed good. We came to an agreement. That's about it.
All right.
I should probably say that Blue Manchu is a pretty relaxed studio as well. We don't really do crunch or anything. It's pretty common for 5 o'clock to roll around, and I'm the only person still in the office. And that's just because, that's when you've got a really small group of people working on something, and in our office right now there's 4 of us. Then yeah, you know the people, you care about the people, and lifestyle matters, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think it just gets a lot harder when you're owned by somebody who's not in the room.
Yep, definitely. And discuss about unions and that kind of topic, that's like another hour and a half if we wanted to talk about here. Dragon asks again, like, how many drop bears have you punched? I don't know what that means exactly.
I wouldn't punch a drop bear, because a drop bear always wins a fight. No, you just need to never be under one.
All right.
That's the approach that works.
All right. So I think with that,
Yep.
just a few quick wrap-up questions, and then we will say goodnight. But Farbs, it's been great having you on, and yeah, if you or anyone else from Blue Manchu want to come back on in a few months' time, we can always do a follow-up.
Yeah, that could be fun. All right, let's pencil that in.
All right. So, with that said, to clarify for people who turned in late and whatnot, in terms of when Void Bastards is coming out, what is the tentative release date?
The tentative release date is, we've been saying, early 2019.
Okay. And we've already mentioned it's going to be on Steam. Any other platforms you're planning on doing?
Yeah, it's going to be on Xbox at launch, Xbox One.
All right. And I gotta ask, with like all the news that's going around, any thoughts about putting it on the Epic Games Store? Dragons in chat just said the exact same time. That is perfect.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's definitely the kind of thing that we're talking with Humble about.
Mm-hmm.
They're our publisher for the game, and so of course the game will be on the Humble store at launch as well. But I don't know where we're at on that at the moment.
All right.
I think more stores is great. Very welcoming of lots of competition in that space. So really excited to see stuff really starting to build up, and a lot of energy coming behind that.
All right. No talk about like GOG or Discord yet?
I can't remember where we're at with the various stores.
Okay.
We're focused on just making this thing. We should probably think harder about that stuff.
All right. Well, I think that is it for me. But like I said, Farbs, it has been great. Someone said put on a cartridge too. All right. Well, it has been
Excellent.
great having you on. Definitely the best of luck with Void Bastards. I can't wait to check it out when it is due next year.
Yeah, that'll be really, really great to have another chat when you've played it a bit and can point out some questions and really dig into it.
All
It'll be
right.
fun.
So,
right.
My final thing for you then is, you have anything you'd like to say to the fans, or anything about Void Bastards to wrap up our cast on?
Tell your friends. I don't know. I honestly think, like, if you're a fan of a game and you want to see it succeed, that is honestly the biggest deal. Like, a personal recommendation means so much more than advertising or anything like that. So yeah, that means a great deal to us whenever anybody talks about our games with their friends.
Awesome.
So, yeah, if you're interested in it, please do.
Great. So with that said, we are going to wrap things up for now. Again, it is my dinner time. It's probably Farbs' lunchtime at this point. So
yep, pretty much.
We do have to get going for that, no matter how much people want to see us, starve and dehydrate on Steam or on the stream here. So,
yeah.
Again, Farbs, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you tonight. Best of luck with the game, and yes. If again in the future, it'll be great to have you back on.
All right, thanks so much. I guess I'll talk to you again later.
No problem. Like I said, if you wouldn't mind hanging on Discord like right after the cast, I just have one question to ask you. But for next cast, we'll say dehydration. But for everybody watching this live or recorded right now, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to check out our Discord channel, our Patreon, as well as my first book linked down below. The Discord is open to everybody, so feel free to join. If you'd like to watch this ad-free and uncut in the future, check out patreon.com/gwbeister. I will be back on later tonight for our regular game streams. But with that said, once again, this has been another great Perceptive podcast. Tune in for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where he's in the art and science of games. So, until next time.
I want to jump in as well, just before we sign off. And a very quick reminder, we have a Steam store page up. Wish lists really help to boost the visibility of the game even before it's released. So if you're interested, click that button. You don't have to buy it. It'd be great if you did. But yeah, thanks.
All right, and do you have any social media you would like to plug, whether for you, Blue Manchu, Void Bastards, whatever?
Yeah, I think we're pretty active on Twitter, so jump on there, type in Void Bastards, and you'll find us.
All right, so that's it for